Welcome once again to Colorado and Me. I am your host, George Blaze. Today, we're going to be talking about some very important topics and issues, particularly when we're talking about equity and social justice and trying to educate each other, particularly in the private sector, on how these things actually functionally work, how corporations, organizations, and as individuals, we can do better to understand and to push the ball forward in terms of making things fair and equitable for everybody involved and to increase the diversity that we are always so proud of here in this country. Joining me today is Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler, Chief Catalyst for the Equity Project, LLC. Dr. Tyler, it's wonderful to finally talk to you.
That's great to be with you today. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's an understatement to say that we're living in some very unique and troubling times in a lot of ways, particularly when we're talking about race relations, equity, equality. You delve deep into this stuff, and I like the fact that as your title as Chief Catalyst. I know in chemistry, a catalyst is an element that you add uh, to a compound to start a reaction that doesn't actually have to be a part of the reaction. Tell me a little bit about what the Equity Project is all about.
Sure. I started the Equity Project in 2016. I found myself sitting in the executive suite of Children's Hospital Colorado, loving my job. And I realized that our country was starting to polarize. Not only was our country polarizing, but our communities and even workplaces were polarizing around their ability to talk about the very things you're talking about. How do we talk about race or equity or inclusion? And I was troubled, if I can be really honest with you, about our inability to do that well. And I was forecasting that if we didn't do that well in 2016, as we went forward, it would get harder and harder. I think my inclination was right. So I started the Equity Project as a means to help organizations and communities and systems across the country figure out better, more inclusive and collective ways to advance these strategies.
Well, I had the opportunity when I was in my high school years. One of my best friends growing up, his father actually co-authored the Don't Ask, Don't Tell piece of legislation for the United States military in terms of how they were going to deal with people with different sexual orientations there. And now, in retrospect, it seems like that framework was a mistake in a lot of ways. I wonder if you could shed some light on what they did wrong in that and what is different today.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I also think it's a long running history about the suppression of difference. We've been a country and a society that really has an affinity towards acculturation and assimilation. And the reality is, the word diversity in and of itself is purely about difference. And so, one of the things that I think we'll have to do a better job of so that we inform our policies and our processes and even our relationships better is to lift up what the word diversity actually means. We've really gone sideways with what the word means. It is not a synonym for race. We use it quite often as a synonym for race. The word just means difference, the richness and the beauty of the differences of all of us. And if we can get back to that pure definition of what it means, then we don't have to create programs, processes, and strategies that seek to suppress those differences, but in contrast, will uplift those differences for good.
Well, I am sure as we look, particularly in dealing with the private sector, we can talk about what's happened in the last year here with everything that's gone on with the protests and things for social justice and what's been going on the streets. Is that many of the biggest corporations, companies, and private sector individuals that are out here really made an effort to show an overt flag of we understand and we're doing this, that, and the other, and we're going to wash your feet and things. And to me personally, I almost started to become offended that they're just paying lip service, but what actual change is going to happen within the organization?
Yeah, wash your feet. I love that. Uh, I share your sentiments. I do think that there were organizations out there that were authentically sound in their messaging and their commitment for what they'd be doing. And then I do think there are organizations that were right smack in the middle of what I call fakequity. Fakequity, word of the day. Fake equity. That's what fakequity means. So you have a lot of organizations that are really in performative mode. They made a statement, they waved a flag, and in essence, they're really done. So we do have both going on in our system today. And I think it's really important that organizations hear me clearly on this. If you don't intend to do anything, then don't say anything. So the doing something is the moment and movement that we're in right now. And I'm actually not sure that we've ever been in this moment before in history.
So, in terms of the process of how this works, I mean, do organizations or corporations find themselves in a legal bind and then they reach out to you, or how does it work? How does it get to a point where a private sector organization says that we need the Equity Project's help on this?
It's all of the above. I do have clients that have been in a legal bind. That's the great minority of them, though. Most folks that work out or reach out to us are people that really do have a willingness and a commitment to advance this work and don't actually know how. And we work across all sectors. It's not just corporations. We work with government systems, law enforcement, first responders, healthcare. It's really across the spectrum and for different reasons. One thing that we are clear about, though, is if an organization is not legitimately committed to doing this work, we are not a good fit for them. And we have had some occasions where we had to say to potential clients that we probably are not a fit for them. They wanted to do something that was more performative. We want to do things that are more sustainable. So all kinds of people reach out.
And yeah, it would seem that without giving specific examples, I mean, we're talking about organizations where it's like, maybe what we're looking for is a PR department to handle Black History Month. We're not actually trying to do anything effective here.
That's exactly right. That's a risk in this work. And it is not a new risk. This is an old risk. This has been going on since the 1970s. And when the diversity movement hit in the late 70s, early 80s, so much of what was happening at that time with the onset of the diversity movement was performative, because it really wasn't born out of a willingness to embrace what diversity brought to the table. It was a response to what affirmative action was saying, which is we are going to right a historical hiring discrimination wrong, and we will do it this way. That was the kickoff of this moment. And so if we go back in our history, we will see that we probably never really made the compelling case for diversity in the hearts and minds of people. And here we are in 2020 trying to reconcile that now.
Well, it's got to be. Of course, it's challenging work, and it's productive, and it really helps all people involved. But there has to be there's the challenge of and I remember back to my college years when I landed on campus at the University of Illinois. It was the first time I had met white people who had never interacted with Black people before, and being from Chicago, that was a very foreign thing to me to understand that there are some white people who just have never interacted with a gay person. There's straight people who've never been around gay people. There's white people who've never been around Black people. Just to get over that hurdle.
Yeah, I absolutely can relate to that. I went to the University of Alabama, where I was a roommate of a white girl that had never been in proximity to a Black girl. So we have that all over the place. We just have not had experiences in proximity. And of course, when you don't have proximity experiences, it's easy enough to spin your narrative about who you think the people are that you're not in proximity to. So I think we're seeing that illuminated now in this moment too, that so much of what's going on has a lot to do with us not having had an opportunity to be with each other or to be together in understanding. So we still have a lot of work to do. Think about the urban-rural divide as well. Even in our own state, where have we had opportunities for urban and rural to convene in a way that we can work in a collective? That's an important thing for us to be thinking about.
Yes, it's particularly interesting to look at in that way. One of the other things about the modern times that we're living in now is, and this is not a critique of progressivism, but um, the acronyms keep building and building and building and building, and it seems sometimes difficult to even keep up with what is appropriate and what is not appropriate in terms of the language we use to talk to each other, to address each other. I get thrown off when I see in people, personal work emails, that they have the preferred pronouns and stuff, and they're like, I don't know what to do with some of this stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that because it is the source of what we call diversity fatigue. And it's a real fatigue. It is, I am tired of having to tackle what word am I supposed to use or who am I going to offend and all of those things. This diversity fatigue phenomenon, I want people to know, is a real thing that gets in the way of us doing this work, working in a collective, being committed to advancing equity. And so I want you to know that racial equity sorts of agendas that we have right now to try to reckon with our racial past is mired in diversity fatigue that's sitting in all of us. So my advice here is every time something changes, doesn't mean that you have to necessarily pivot, but it does mean that you just listen, you just learn, and you just understand. And your pivot might come a little bit later. We won't all pivot at the same time every time we hear a new word or a new nomenclature or way to look at something. So preferred pronouns, as we have socialized the needs of the transgender community in particular, there's new language, there's new understanding that we have to try to understand. I just want people to know that your pivot and your understanding are two different things, but to understand and have some proximity to these changes will be important.
Yeah, I mean it's a real thing, and like I said, I don't necessarily want to castigate people on either side about it, but there come these moments when we're having honest conversations, honest dialogues about some of these issues, particularly in diverse groups, where you come to a point where you have a divergence of what the underlying factual information is going on. And try to figure out, like, okay, if we're not even agreeing on some fundamental baseline facts about reality, then how are we having a dialogue? How is anything gained by the dialogue?
Yeah, I so appreciate that conversation. I too struggle with the picking and choosing of fact over fiction, over opinion. And some of that really is born out of what we call the recency effect. We are living in snapshots and episodes. And anytime you live in a snapshot, the only thing you're really going to remember is what just happened or what just happened yesterday. That becomes your worldview. And we have a preponderance of folks living in recency effect right now. And you know what it's based on are news cycles, and what's going on in the world keeps you in recency. And the risk factor in living in the recency effect is then we don't have a way to tie things together. You can't make critical decisions when you haven't tied things together. So all of us now are walking around with a little snapshot of a story, which is a really dangerous proposition as we try to create good strategies in our country and in our world.
I've heard, this debate in certain circles that there is a difference between equity and equality, and what these words mean and what we're actually talking about. We have to be very clear on what it is we're asking for. I'm wondering if you could delve a little bit into that.
Sure, they are very different words. And the word equality is the one we're probably most familiar with because we've been at that one a little bit longer. So if you go back a little bit in history, equality is what we saw in most of our major movements: civil rights movement, women's rights movement, gay rights movement, labor movement. Those movements were an example of equality. Basically, what we were attempting to do was level set, make things equal, provide access to. to bring one group up to the same standard as the other groups. That's what equality seeks to do. We still have work to do there, but that's what it does. Equity, on the other hand, says this. It says that you are creating systems where everyone in the system gets exactly what they need to thrive. But that doesn't mean everybody gets the same thing. They get exactly what they need. And that's an entire different sort of strategy and model that really requires that you take a look at your own systems. And so you know this, that our country and the systems in our country were not necessarily built to be that nimble, not nimble enough for me to look at my system and say, hey, George needs this, but Nita doesn't. And so let me then implement in a customized way like that. That's what equity actually calls for.
When you watch, your nightly news or your local or particularly in the Denver area, there's a lot going on that isn't going on in other parts of the country. You've been around, you've seen a lot. Is there something different about what's going on in the streets today?
Yeah, so I grew up in the civil rights movement in the segregated South. So in many ways, this is a little bit like Groundhog's Day for me, or whack-a-mole. I'm not sure which one. But there is something that's very different about this moment and what I experienced and lived through back in the 60s. And one of the differences is we seem to have less of a willingness now to complete the sentence. We seem a bit comfortable living in the recency effect and making our judgments and our decisions on what's in front of us right now in the moment. That is something that I didn't see back then. I also don't see the sage wisdom that I saw back in the civil rights movement, where you had sage leaders that gave guidance and talked about how to unify and work a bit in a collective. I'm missing some of that in what's going on right now. We do see more young people in leadership roles in this movement. That's not half bad at all. I appreciate them, but I worry about whether or not they've got enough guidance from elders around where the landmines are in a movement like this. I do think also, probably for the first time in my life, I do see equity in our sight line. I've never had it in my sight line before. I think it's in the sight line, but I think if we're not careful about our approach to it, we could go backwards. So I'm very protective of what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how we come together, which is what this is going to call for to get it done.
A lot of this work involves direct one-on-one dialogue and conversation. Perhaps are there any mnemonic tools or vocabulary devices that you can share with us that are easy to incorporate that will help in these situations where disagreement doesn't just become an argument, where you're actually respecting the other person's views while still disagreeing?
Yeah, I've got some solutions. One of them is something that my husband and I started just a couple of years ago. And it was a desire for us to teach others how to talk about race so that they might go out in their own communities and lead conversations. It's called Race Talk University. And it's a wonderful cohort of community members that sign up to come together to learn over 8 weeks how to best talk about race and lead those conversations in their own lives. It's a wonderful opportunity for people to get a chance to practice and learn together. I also suggest, as much as you can, to create small circles, whether you're a corporation or a community group, small circles of people that come together to talk about race and equity. Now, we're centering on race right now because we're in a racial reckoning. And so if you skip over an ability to talk about that, you miss the mark really on what equity is all about. So anytime you can create small circles of people to have a space filled with grace, that's what I call them, spaces that don't have judgment or critique as a part of them, to talk about that's what's really important. One of my favorite websites that I will share with you that I think offers up lots of tools and tips on how you navigate in a climate like this, how you assess how you're doing as an organization, is called racialequitytools.org. I love it a lot. Policylink.org is also a great website because it gives you lots of case studies and examples of what it looks like when a community or an organization actually employs equity strategies in its work. So those are just some of my favorite go-tos.
That's great advice there and great information. Thank you for sharing that. One of the other things that has changed over the past decade or so has been how social media has really become part and parcel of everybody's life and everything we do, and has changed the landscape of communication, of just the basic ways people communicate, and in some ways for the positive, but I think in many ways for the negative. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about how social media plays a role in the struggle.
Yeah, so social media is prominent, of course, but again, the risk factor is that it creates a snapshot of a scenario and not the whole story. Unfortunately, the other part about social media, as much as I love it because I'm always on social media, is that it can create a sort of contagion around information that could be false. So it spreads false news and it can spread accurate news. The problem that we're in right now is no one can decipher which one is which. And so we don't know what percentage of people are attributing their thinking to the false news versus who's attributing their thinking to the correct news. And social media makes that so viral that we don't know how far that's going. And the balancing act here is then we don't have our trusted media sources operating in a way that people can decipher either. So we're sort of cherry picking what we want to believe, and that could be a danger in what we're trying to do in our country.
That's been one of the things that's really been driving me nuts the last couple of years. I've been off of Facebook, particularly for the last 2 years, specifically because I kept finding myself getting into arguments with people who I know well and people who I only know peripherally about things that have snowballed by the time they got to me, to a point where it's like you have lost the entire point of the kernel of where this started. Now we're just arguing for the sake of arguing. Now there's other strangers jumping in and throwing matches on it. I could not take it anymore.
Yeah. So I've had that a little bit too, where sometimes people disagree with my approach. My approach is really about grace, and my approach is also about collective work. Not everybody agrees with my approach, and I've had people sort of lash out about that with me, and that maybe I need to be a little bit more forward or hard hitting in my approach. One of the things I do know about social media, and maybe it's just my age at this point, social media is not in charge of your identity and who you are and who you stand for. And if you allow it to do that to you, then I would argue that you're not whole anyway. I always tell that to people, especially young people, is if Facebook or Instagram or Twitter is shaping who you are, you're in the wrong ball game. You should be shaping it, not it shaping you. And so I think there is a maturity level like nobody's business that is important in social media today, because it can be really harmful if you're not solid in what your own identity is. I guess the other benefit to social media is when people come your way that are just being toxic, you just block them. Wish we could do that in real life sometimes, but hey.
It's difficult sometimes, particularly if you live in the same house with them.
Exactly. I've tried. It doesn't work.
Removing toxic people from your life is really key. And I think, since we've been on this ongoing COVID-19 lockdown situation, people are feeling very isolated right now. And I almost think it's making people's nerves even more on edge, that just going to the grocery store now, it seems like just people are just on edge and just ready to break at any moment. I think it's just a lack of contact.
It's a lack of contact, and if I can be really honest with you, it's also called grief. Our whole country is in the middle of grief. The world as we once knew it is dead, just like any other death. That's what we're in. The things we know and we used to do are gone, and we don't know if they're ever going to be the same again. So everybody's in grief. I'm really good about naming things. And we're all in a different part of the grief cycle. That's the other thing. Some people are still in denial, in the denial stage. We still have people that are in denial that COVID-19 is a thing. And then we have people that are in the anger stage after the George Floyd death. People launched into anger. So now you've got denial happening, anger happening. The depression stage of grief is very present. And the bargaining stage of grief is very present, where people are starting to make meaning of what's going on right now. They're trying to make sense of it. And then there's the acceptance stage of grief, where people actually have moved on because they've got a new plan. So we are all sitting in all 5 parts of that grief. And a part of the head banging that you're seeing right now normally happens when people are in those first 2 or 3 stages. They're in denial, anger, or depression. That's where the head banging starts, especially if people are in the anger stage of grief.
Well, Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler, Chief Catalyst for the Equity Project LLC. The work continues. We love the work you're doing. Make sure you guys log on to the website there and get more information. We'll put that on the screen for you there. And thank you for everything you're doing. I'm glad that you're happy and healthy. And perhaps as we move through this winter and we go into a new spring in 2021, we'll wipe away all this stuff. We'll have you back on and see if we can't talk about some more positive stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. You take good care.
And you do the same. And thank you all for watching Colorado and Me.